Here is your podcast script. Good evening, and welcome to your daily news briefing. I'm glad you're here. Today is Thursday, June 19, 2026, and it is Juneteenth, a federal holiday. So if you're listening on the day this drops, happy Juneteenth. We're going to take a moment to be here, together, before we get into what turned out to be a very full day of news. And when I say full, I mean it. We've got a major diplomatic confrontation between the United States and its closest ally in the Middle East. We've got Ukraine launching what may be the most consequential drone attack of the entire war right into the heart of Moscow. We've got a Supreme Court ruling on guns, the Obama Presidential Center finally opening after a decade of planning, a Democratic socialist almost certainly becoming the next mayor of Washington, D.C., and, in New York City, something that hasn't happened in 53 years, a Knicks championship parade down Broadway. We're going to get to all of it. Let's start at the top. The biggest story out of Washington today is one that's been building since President Trump's preliminary deal with Iran was announced, the growing rupture between the United States and Israel. And today, Vice President J.D. Vance made that rupture very visible. Vance held a news conference at the White House to defend the Iran deal against mounting criticism from all directions. Israeli officials have called it a disaster. Gulf states are frustrated it doesn't address Iran's ballistic missile program. And some Republicans on Capitol Hill argue it hands Iran economic relief while extracting only minimal concessions, at least for now. Vance pushed back on all of it. He talked up the falling gas prices. He argued the United States still holds leverage over Iran. But the moment that drew the most attention was what he said about Israel. He described President Trump as, in his words, the only head of state in the entire world who is sympathetic to Israel, and then he issued a blunt warning to Israeli leaders who've been critical of the deal. His message was essentially, you might not want to attack the only powerful ally you have. That is a remarkable thing for an American vice president to say publicly. And it landed hard in Israel. To understand why, you have to understand what Israelis actually see when they look at this deal. And it's not pretty from their vantage point. The agreement does nothing to dismantle Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. It does nothing to cut off Iranian support for Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. It requires Israel to withdraw its forces from southern Lebanon. And the existential issue that Benjamin Netanyahu built his entire career around, Iran's nuclear weapons program, was left for a later stage of negotiations. Not resolved. Deferred. Israeli analysts were not holding back. One former national security advisor called it a bad agreement in which the Americans, quote, are paying with cash and got, at the maximum, a letter of intent. The editor of the Times of Israel used the phrase catastrophic capitulation. And one television analyst compared the deal to a diplomatic October 7, meaning it was a cataclysmic surprise that Israel was wholly unprepared for. Netanyahu himself was relatively restrained in public, saying only that additional challenges lie ahead, and vowing that Israel would not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons and would not withdraw from its security zone in southern Lebanon. But that last part directly contradicts what the deal apparently requires. So there is a collision coming. And it's not just about the deal itself. The broader relationship between Trump and Netanyahu appears to be under serious strain. Earlier this week at the G7 summit in France, Trump described Netanyahu publicly as a very small partner and suggested he was excitable and prone to overreacting. He belittled the threat from Iranian ballistic missiles, the very missiles that forced millions of Israelis to run for shelters throughout this war. He even suggested that Syria might do a better job than Israel of dealing with Hezbollah, without killing as many civilians. The reaction in Israel cut across political lines. A lawmaker from Netanyahu's own Likud party posted a video of himself removing a red MAGA hat and replacing it with a blue cap that said "Total Victory" in Hebrew. Columnists wrote that Netanyahu had led Israel into the most severe collapse in its history. One pollster put it this way: Netanyahu staked the entire U.S.-Israeli relationship on his personal bond with a president prone to, quote, temper tantrums over simple slights. And he hit his limit. Now let's look at the deal itself from the other side, because there's a genuine argument to be made, and Vance made it today, at length, in a fascinating interview with New York Times opinion columnist Ross Douthat. Vance's central claim is that this deal is fundamentally different from the 2015 Obama nuclear deal in one critical way: Iran's nuclear program has been physically destroyed. Facilities buried. Centrifuges gone. And crucially, Iran has agreed to destroy its existing stockpile of enriched uranium, something the Obama deal actually allowed Iran to keep building. Vance says that without money and without infrastructure, Iran couldn't build a nuclear weapon during this administration even if it tried. He also made a point about the regional reaction. He said the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait are actually enthusiastic about this deal, and that those are the countries who know Iran best, who live next door to Iran, and who hated the Obama deal. Their support, in Vance's view, is meaningful. Critics, though, point to something worth sitting with. An expert quoted in the Times today said the deal, quote, appears to favor Iran, because Tehran gets sanctions relief, oil export waivers, and a reduction in military pressure right now, while the hardest concessions, particularly on the nuclear program's future, are postponed for the next 60 days of talks. One analyst was blunt about it: it's difficult to escape the conclusion that these negotiations could have taken place without a 3-month war. And she added that she's skeptical the next 60 days will produce concrete results. In her words, this is merely kicking the can down the road. Meanwhile, shortly after Vance spoke at the White House, Iran's supreme leader offered his own characterization of the deal. He said Trump had agreed to the terms out of desperation and promised Iran would not submit to excessive demands. Iran also announced that commercial ships seeking to pass through the Strait of Hormuz would need to submit requests to a new agency they're calling the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. And on the NATO front, because this week keeps expanding, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was in Brussels, and he was not in a diplomatic mood. He called NATO allies shameful for refusing to let American jets and ships use European bases during the strikes against Iran. He announced a 6-month review of the U.S. troop presence in Europe and suggested the United States would reduce what it pays in NATO dues if members don't increase defense spending. France, Italy, and Spain all refused to support the Iran operation in various ways. France and Italy wouldn't allow U.S. bombers to take off from their soil, and Spain blocked American military jets from using its airspace. Hegseth's message was essentially, there are consequences for that. And NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, played the whole thing down publicly, but you could hear the tension underneath his words. One other piece of news with a direct impact on your wallet: gas prices. The average price of gasoline in the United States fell below $4 a gallon today for the first time in months, tied directly to the Iran deal reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But don't expect your airline tickets to get cheaper anytime soon. Aviation experts say jet fuel costs are locked in for the next 3 or 4 months for most airlines, and airlines have also learned something uncomfortable during this conflict: travelers are willing to pay more for tickets even when prices go up. Flights within the United States are currently about 28% more expensive than they were a year ago. International tickets are up 18%. The longer elevated prices hold, the more likely airlines are to just keep them there. One airline CEO said flat out, if customers stop buying, carriers will run fewer flights before they'll cut prices. Let's move to Ukraine, because today brought some dramatic and sobering footage out of Moscow. Ukrainian forces launched what appears to be the largest drone attack on the Russian capital since Vladimir Putin started this war more than 4 years ago. An oil refinery was struck, sending plumes of toxic black smoke into the sky over Moscow. All 4 of Moscow's airports were urgently closed for hours. A major ring road was shut down. At least 17 people were injured. The Russian Defense Ministry said it shot down 992 Ukrainian drones countrywide in a single attack, the largest number ever reported in one day. It also downed 4 cruise missiles. But some got through, and the footage of the refinery burning is dramatic. Volodymyr Zelensky framed this as direct retaliation. Earlier this week, Russia struck the Pechersk Lavra Monastery complex in Kiev, one of the holiest sites in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Russia claimed it was an accident, a Ukrainian interceptor missile that went astray. Zelensky said in a voice memo today, if Ukraine burns, then your Moscow will burn as well. For context, this kind of attack matters beyond its military effect. For most of this war, the Kremlin has been remarkably successful at insulating ordinary Russians from the reality of the conflict. Rationing at gas stations, fuel shortages, economic strain, these things have been seeping in over time. But drone strikes on Moscow's refinery, visible black smoke over residential neighborhoods, no sirens and no warning to citizens, that is a different psychological experience. One Moscow resident, a self-described opponent of Putin, told the Times that his neighbors were walking around asking, how is this possible? He said they felt anger and confusion but couldn't yet connect Russia's invasion of Ukraine to the attacks at home. His analogy was striking: It's like they were told for a long time not to look up, and now it's as if they have lifted their heads for the first time. Hardliners in Russia responded by calling on the Kremlin to unleash the full force of the military, to strike the enemy mercilessly. That raises the prospect of a new cycle of escalation, competing aerial bombardments far from the front lines, with no obvious off-ramp in sight. Whether this pushes Putin towards some kind of negotiation remains deeply unclear. Russia has publicly maintained it won't stop fighting until it controls the rest of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, and Ukraine still holds a substantial piece of that territory. Now, turning back to the United States, here's a story about a very expensive mistake that the Trump administration is quietly trying to walk back. Immigration and Customs Enforcement spent $1 billion buying 11 large warehouses across the country to supercharge mass deportations. The idea was to give ICE massive new detention capacity, processing centers where people could be arrested, processed, and quickly moved through the system. The program was a signature initiative of the previous Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem. Now, the agency is planning to give away or sell 7 of those warehouses, the ones that cost more than $700 million combined. Why? A combination of things went wrong. Environmental lawsuits piled up because ICE skipped required reviews of the impact on local communities. Federal judges in Maryland, New Jersey, and Michigan all blocked work at various sites. The Homeland Security Department's own Inspector General opened an investigation into the purchases. Local communities, including in conservative areas, revolted. And the practical challenge of converting an industrial warehouse into a humane detention facility with proper water, sewage, and ventilation turned out to be enormously complicated and expensive. The new Homeland Security Secretary, Markwayne Mullin, has said publicly that he wants ICE to be quieter about enforcement. And behind the scenes, he had privately expressed skepticism about the warehouse plan from the beginning. ICE appears to be pressing forward with 4 of the 11 locations in Texas, Arizona, and Maryland, though a judge has already blocked the Maryland facility. The agency also says it will look to buy detention space from private prison companies it already works with. The broader question this raises is about ICE's ability to carry out the scale of deportations the administration has promised. Without enough detention beds, the math doesn't work. The White House border czar, Tom Homan, said earlier this year he hoped to have 100,000 detention beds by the end of 2025. The agency topped out at about 70,000. Switching gears to health news, and there are 2 stories today worth knowing about. The first involves a weight loss drug called retatrutide. This is a drug still in development, not expected to reach the U.S. market before next year at the earliest. The FDA has explicitly warned against taking anything claiming to be the drug. And yet, 15 pounds of it, potentially hundreds of thousands of doses, has flowed into the United States just between January and April of this year, based on analysis of FDA data. People are getting it from WhatsApp groups, Chinese labs, and websites that sell it for research purposes. On social media, influencers are advertising it using code words ratatouille for retatrutide, peps for peptides, to get around restrictions on advertising unapproved drugs. The drug is reportedly more powerful than anything currently on the market for weight loss. One man interviewed by The Times had it in his freezer, 20 vials he bought with Bitcoin from a website. Another man started taking it after failing to get into a clinical trial. He weighed 447 pounds and felt he couldn't wait. The risks are real. The FDA's database shows 40 people have reported adverse reactions since 2024, including cardiac issues and life-threatening responses. 14 were hospitalized. Because these products aren't regulated, there's no reliable way to know if what you're buying is actually retatrutide, what dose it contains, or whether it's contaminated. The second health story is more hopeful. Scientists are seriously investigating whether anti-inflammatory drugs could help treat a subset of depression, specifically in patients who have elevated levels of inflammatory proteins in their blood. About 25% of people with depression fall into this category, and those patients are actually less likely to respond to traditional antidepressants like SSRIs. The research is still early stage and the results are mixed. A recent small study using a rheumatoid arthritis drug showed a reduction in depression symptoms, but the difference wasn't statistically significant compared to a placebo. Scientists are calling for larger trials. But the underlying biology is compelling. Inflammatory proteins can lower levels of serotonin and dopamine, and disrupt the exact areas of the brain that are altered in depression. Some researchers have started calling this inflamed depression a distinct subtype that might require a completely different treatment approach. The Supreme Court issued a significant ruling today on gun rights. The justices unanimously sided with a marijuana user in Texas who challenged a federal law that bans drug users from owning or possessing firearms. The court's decision, written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, found that the law was being applied too broadly, sweeping together occasional recreational drug users with people actually addicted to dangerous substances. The court said the government's approach didn't hold up against the historical analysis required by its 2022 landmark Second Amendment ruling. This case drew some unusual alliances. The Trump administration actually defended the gun law in this case. On the other side, the National Rifle Association and the ACLU both supported the Texas gun owner who brought the challenge. The court was careful to limit the ruling. It said it was only addressing people who use drugs, not people who are addicted, and not people who are actively intoxicated. And it explicitly invited Congress to pass new, more targeted legislation if it determines that users of specific drugs pose a particular risk. Justice Alito, in a concurring opinion joined by Justice Kagan, which is itself a remarkable pairing, wrote that marijuana use today is, quote, like alcohol use at the founding, widespread and increasingly considered socially acceptable in many quarters. Let's go to Chicago, where something happened today that a lot of people have been waiting a long time to see. The Obama Presidential Center officially opened on the south side of Chicago, in Jackson Park, with a star-studded celebration that included Bruce Springsteen, Bono, Christina Aguilera, Jennifer Hudson, and 3 former presidents, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden, all on stage together with Barack Obama. Trump was not invited. He recently compared the center to a trash heap. The museum took more than a decade of planning and years of legal battles with preservationists before it finally came together. At $850 million, built with private donations on a 19-acre campus, it includes a museum, a playground, a library, a basketball court, and a sledding hill. Tickets are $30 for adults, a bit less for Illinois residents. It's already sold out through November. Obama, who came to Chicago from New York more than 40 years ago in a beat-up car so stuffed with his belongings he couldn't see out the back window, said the center is meant to be an affirmation of just how special, how precious, our democracy truly is. Michelle Obama gave the speech of the day. She recounted her husband's presidency rescuing the economy, expanding healthcare, comforting Americans through tragedies, and then, in what was clearly an implicit rebuke of the current president, she said he did it all while enduring attacks on his birthplace and his patriotism. You did it all with such grace and class and cool that you made the hardest job in the world look like a walk in this beautiful park, she said. Obama, standing next to her, looked down and wiped away tears. Across the Atlantic, the Church of England issued a formal apology today for its role in the decades-long practice of forced adoptions. Between the late 1940s and the mid-1970s, tens of thousands of unmarried pregnant women and girls in England and Wales were sent to institutions called mother and baby homes, where their babies were taken from them. An estimated 185,000 babies were separated from their mothers during this period. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally, said in the apology that the church had listened to first-hand accounts from survivors who described the pain, shame and indignity experienced both then and now. She said, "The shame you were made to feel was wrong. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Rather, we are deeply ashamed that this happened to people in the care of Christian communities." The Church of England said it was involved in potentially more than 200 mother and baby homes in England and Wales. The practice exploited the stigma around pregnancy outside marriage, placing all the burden of shame on the women and girls while the men involved faced no scrutiny at all. Advocates who fought for years to get this apology say the British government is expected to follow with its own apology very soon. One survivor, who had her daughter taken from her in 1974, told the BBC, "We've been waiting a very long time for an acknowledgement in public that this was an injustice." In political news, Washington, D.C. will almost certainly have a new mayor, and she's a Democratic socialist. Janice Lewis George, a city councilwoman, won the Democratic primary for mayor with about 53% of the vote, enough for an outright majority, meaning the ranked choice system didn't even need to kick in. In an overwhelmingly Democratic city, winning the Democratic primary is tantamount to winning the office. She will almost certainly be Washington's next leader. Her win continues what's turning into a real pattern. Democratic socialists have now won or are likely to win the mayor's seat in New York City, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. Los Angeles will be the next test this fall. What makes Washington unique is its status as the nation's capital, where the federal government retains some control over the National Guard and budget. President Trump, during a recent interview, threatened to, quote, take back Washington and run it on a federal basis if Louis George wins, essentially threatening to revoke the limited self-governance Congress gave the district decades ago. Her response on election night? She said voters told her, "If Trump doesn't like you, I love you." One of her key policy positions that will immediately put her in conflict with the Trump administration, she has said she will rescind the police department order that permits officers to cooperate with ICE, share information with ICE, and transfer detainees to ICE custody. Here's a story about schools that's unsettling if you have kids, or if you care about education. AI cheating is becoming nearly impossible to detect, and some companies are actively marketing that fact to students. There's an entire ecosystem of tools now, things called humanizers and autotypers, that rewrite AI-generated text to make it sound like a human wrote it, and then simulate the typing process so that even a document's version history looks like a student actually typed the essay word by word, including fake typos and revisions. Influencers with millions of followers are making videos on TikTok and YouTube showing students exactly how to use these tools to get away with cheating. Some of the videos are labeled ads, many are not. And here's the part that might surprise you: in some cases, the very same companies selling AI detection tools to schools are also selling AI writing tools to students. Several apps explicitly promise students that their work will pass the detectors those same companies sell to teachers. About 2/3 of American students are regularly using AI for schoolwork, according to recent surveys. Only about 9% admit to outright cheating, but there's a large gray area in between. Over 90% of professors in one survey expressed concern about plagiarism and dishonesty related to AI. Schools are spending significant money on detection software, and educators say they're losing the arms race. One Grammarly executive described the situation as bigger cat, bigger mouse, and argued the race between detection and evasion is ultimately a dead end. Her suggestion: accept that most future writing will be produced in partnership between AI and human judgment. But educators who study the issue warn that cognitive offloading, the process where people stop building skills because they're outsourcing thinking to a machine, is a real risk, and one that may be very hard to reverse. A quick sweep of more top stories. In Europe, there's a second heatwave hitting Western Europe just 2 weeks after an unusually early and severe heatwave in May. Temperatures are expected to reach as high as 113 degrees Fahrenheit this weekend. Hot, dry air from North Africa has formed a dome over the Iberian Peninsula and is pushing northward through France, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. Air conditioning is rare across most of Western Europe, and the heat is shocking both residents and tourists who specifically planned their trips to avoid the brutal summer temperatures they expected in July and August. Paris is allowing swimming in the Canal Saint-Martin to give people somewhere to cool off. In Missouri, a skydiving plane crashed Sunday at a drop zone in Butler, killing 12 people, 11 passengers, and the pilot. A skydiver named Lacey Reynolds witnessed the crash, knew 10 of the 12 people who died, including a close friend, and then hours later, after speaking to police and visiting the families of the victims, she went up and jumped again. She said she knew herself, and she knew that the longer you stay on the ground after something like that, the harder it becomes to go back. Her story is a remarkable piece of reporting on grief, community, and what we do when something we love is also where tragedy happens. Near Stonehenge, British archaeologists announced they've discovered what they believe is an ancient site used for solstice rituals, 2 pits about 400 feet apart in a village called Bulford, just 3 miles from the famous stone circle. The pits are carbon dated to about 5,000 years ago, and researchers believe they once held wooden poles aligned with the sun during the solstices, making this potentially a place of solstice worship about 500 years before Stonehenge's famous stones were even erected. Thousands of people are expected to gather at Stonehenge in just a few days for the summer solstice, and it seems people have been doing something very similar nearby for an extraordinarily long time. And in the English village of Sherwood Forest, the major oak has died. This was a tree between 800 and 1200 years old. It was massive, a twisted trunk with a circumference of 36 feet and a canopy that once spread 91 feet wide. Its legend was tied to Robin Hood, who was said to have hidden himself and his loot in its hollow trunk. But over the years, a combination of things killed it. Millions of tourists compacted the soil around its roots to the density of rock. Misguided conservation efforts, iron rods, lead sheeting, concrete bases for support poles, caused further damage. And then came climate change, record heat waves and dry hot summers that the already weakened trees simply couldn't withstand. This spring, no buds appeared. The custodians of the forest declared it dead. Its acorns, at least, have been planted across Britain. Now, before we wind down, let's end on something that genuinely lifted a lot of hearts today. New York City had its first ever ticker tape parade for the Knicks. The team won its first NBA championship in 53 years, and today, Lower Manhattan became a sea of blue and orange. 2,500 pounds of confetti. An estimated 10,000 police officers. Fans who arrived before dawn to secure spots along Broadway. People who paid hundreds of dollars to hire strangers to save their places in line. Workers watching from office windows in the skyscraper canyon. People climbing scaffolding, sanitation trucks, traffic lights, anything to get a glimpse. Jalen Brunson, the finals MVP who scored 45 points in Game 5 to seal the championship, rode through the parade leaning casually on the Larry O'Brien Trophy. Karl Anthony Towns carried it into City Hall to piercing screams from the crowd. Mayor Zoran Mamdani threw t-shirts into the crowd, handed out keys to the city, and delivered the kind of speech that makes a mayor look like a mayor. The Knicks did not just win for New York City, they won like New York City. What is New York if not your back up against the wall? For a city that's been carrying a lot of weight, pandemic losses, political divisions, economic anxiety, there was something cathartic about this. One longtime civil rights lawyer who's been a Knicks fan for decades told The Times, "There's no resentment in this. It's just pure admiration. Pure heart and soul." The team has accepted a White House invitation, by the way. Owner James Dolan, a longtime friend of President Trump's, said the Knicks would be going to Washington. They would be the first NBA team to visit the White House during Trump's presidency. One more quick item: a new podcast from Serial Productions, the people behind Serial and other landmark audio journalism, launched today. It's called The Last 12 Weeks, and it follows a team of Capitol defense lawyers as they try to stop the execution of a man named David Wood, convicted in 1992 as a serial killer. Over 5 episodes, it takes listeners inside the final stretch of a death row case as the clock ticks toward an execution date. If you like narrative audio journalism, it's worth your time. And finally, in Ohio, if you've ever driven east from Columbus on State Route 16, you've probably seen it: a 7-story office building shaped exactly like a basket, an enormous, 800,000 square foot monument to Longaberger baskets, complete with giant heated handles arching over the top to prevent icicles from crashing into the glass atrium below. It was built in 1997, it's been vacant for years, and it is now on the market for $8.5 million. The current owner says he will not sell to anyone who wants to take the handles off and make it stop looking like a basket. That is a hard no. That is your Thursday briefing. We are off tomorrow for Juneteenth, so I'll be back with you on Monday. Until then, take care of yourselves, and thank you so much for listening.